And sometimes he was a good winner, but sometimes a sore loser.
They say time has a way of softening the sharpest edges of memory, but when James Burton turned 85, his voice still trembled as he spoke about Elvis Presley, not because of age, not because of weakness, but because some memories never fade, no matter how many decades pass. For years, James carried a weight that only a few in the world could understand. He wasn't just a guitarist in Elvis Presley's band. He was the guitarist, the man Elvis trusted most when the spotlight was hottest, when the roar of the crowd was deafening, when the king himself leaned back, smiled, and shouted across the stage, "Play it, James." Those words weren't just stage banter. They were trust. They were brotherhood. They were a signal that Elvis Presley, the biggest star in the world, wanted the music in James Burton's hands. And yet, for all the glitter, the screaming fans, and the legendary nights, James also saw a side of Elvis that almost no one else ever did. The exhaustion, the loneliness, the quiet humanity behind the white jumpsuits and the flashing lights. He kept those memories close, hidden in silence for years, until now. At 85, James Burton finally speaks, not with bitterness, not with blame, but with the ache of a man who watched a friend rise, stumble, and fall in front of the entire world. And what he reveals about Elvis's final days is nothing short of heartbreaking. But before we reach that moment, before the tears, the goodbyes, and the silence that fell across the world on August 16, 1977, we have to understand who James Burton was, because the story of Elvis Presley's final years cannot be told without him. James was born in 1939 in Doubly, Louisiana. The house he grew up in was modest, the kind of home where you learned to fix what was broken and make do with what you had. His parents, Guy and Lola, worked hard, but times weren't easy. Yet in that small southern home, something extraordinary was taking shape. A boy discovered a gift that no teacher, no classroom could ever give him. James picked up a guitar and the world shifted. He didn't study scales, he didn't read sheet music, he didn't need to, he simply listened, felt, and let his fingers teach themselves what his heart already knew. By the time he was a teenager, his playing wasn't just good, it was undeniable. People noticed, people whispered, and soon people followed the sound. Louisiana in those days was a melting pot of sound, blues drifting from porches, gospel echoing in church halls, country ballads on the radio, and rockabilly just beginning to find its feet. James absorbed it all. And when he joined the Louisiana Hayride, the very radio show that helped launch a young Elvis Presley, it became clear that this quiet boy with a guitar was destined for something far bigger than the walls of his hometown. But destiny requires bold steps, and for James, that meant leaving everything behind. At just 17 years old, he packed his guitar and headed west to Los Angeles. It was a leap most grown men would hesitate to take. For James, it was the only choice. It didn't take long before opportunity knocked. Ricky Nelson, one of America's fastest-rising stars, beloved on TV and adored on the radio, needed a guitarist. James stepped in, and in doing so, changed the shape of Nelson's sound forever. Together, they recorded Believe What You Say, a song that not only introduced James Burton's guitar to the world, but cemented his reputation as more than just a player. He was a creator. But even before Nelson, James had already left his mark on music history. In 1957, he wrote a riff that would become one of the most recognizable in rock and roll. Susie Q, a riff so iconic it would later land on Rolling Stone's list of the 500 songs that shaped rock and roll. The irony, James never got the credit he deserved. Others added lyrics, others claimed the spotlight, but that unforgettable, hypnotic lick, it was his. And this was the kind of man James Burton was, not loud, not demanding, not chasing headlines. He let his guitar do the talking, and yet, without realizing it, his guitar was already whispering his name into the ear of Elvis Presley. By the mid-1960s, James had become a fixture in studios across Los Angeles. If you picked up a record from the Everly Brothers, Merle Haggard, Glenn Campbell, Johnny Cash, Emmylou Harris, or John Denver, there was a good chance James Burton's fingerprints were on it. Not his face, not his name, but his sound. He was everywhere, quietly shaping the very backbone of American music. It was around this time that Elvis came calling. In 1968, As Presley prepared for his legendary comeback special, he wanted Burton on guitar, but fate intervened. James was too busy, locked into other commitments. The moment passed. But Elvis wasn't done asking. In 1969, the King was about to launch a new era, his first residency in Las Vegas after years away from the stage. This wasn't just another gig. This was the rebirth of Elvis Presley as a live performer. And this time, Elvis didn't just ask James to play guitar. He asked him to help build the band. That band would become the TCB Band, taking care of business, the phrase Elvis lived by, wore on his jewelry, and carried like a motto. James wasn't just joining a group. He was building a family, a handpicked circle of musicians who would stand beside the King night after night, city after city, year after year. From the very first shows in Vegas, the chemistry was undeniable. Elvis commanded the stage with his voice, his charisma, his sheer magnetism. But when it was time to light the fire, when it was time to remind the world that rock and roll still burned hot in his veins, he would turn, grin, and shout across the stage, "Play it, James." And James would answer, not with words, but with strings, precision, tone, fire. Together, they weren't just singer and guitarist. They were partners in an unspoken dance. Elvis needed him. Elvis trusted him. Elvis loved what he could do. That bond only deepened as the years rolled by. Through the 1970s, as Elvis toured relentlessly, James was there. Through exhaustion, through sold-out arenas, through moments when the King himself seemed to live only for the stage, James stood by his side. But what the fans saw, the glitter, the jumpsuits, the energy, wasn't the full story. James knew that better than anyone. He saw the generosity, yes. Elvis handing out jewelry, cars, and kindness like candy. Elvis asking about his family. Elvis making sure the band felt like more than hired hands. But James also saw something else. The toll, the pressure, the nights when the show was over and the lights were dimmed and Elvis was just a man again, tired, hurting, carrying burdens that no amount of applause could take away. And those final months, they would test that bond more than ever. Because as much as James loved Elvis, as much as he respected him, he began to notice something troubling, something he couldn't ignore. Elvis wasn't just pushing himself hard, he was pushing himself beyond breaking. The king of rock and roll, the man adored by millions, was slowly unraveling. James didn't know it then, none of them did, but the last time Elvis would ever say, "Play it," James was already drawing near. And when that day came, it would leave James Burton with a memory so heavy, so raw, that even at 85 years old, his voice would still break when he tried to speak of it. Loyalty is simple when everything is easy. It becomes something else when the person you love starts slipping away from himself. In 1969, when Elvis reached out again, it wasn't a request, it felt like a calling. He wasn't just planning a few shows in Las Vegas, he was staging a resurrection. The world had watched him on television in '68, leaner, hungrier, a spark in his eyes that said the crown wasn't going anywhere. But to carry that spark from the studio to a real stage night after night, he needed players who could translate electricity into heartbeat. He needed someone whose instincts would lock with his without a word. He needed James. James didn't waltz into a job. He built a house. He helped assemble the band that would become the TCB Band, taking care of business, Elvis's creed engraved in gold and carried like armor, drums that could thunder and then vanish into ghosts, keys that could stitch gospel into rock, bass that could carry grief and swagger at once, horns when the room needed to feel expensive, voices that could take a chorus to church, and at the center, a guitar that could be both fire and prayer. From the first rehearsals, there was an unspoken agreement. The job wasn't just to play songs, the job was to lift Elvis. He'd glance over his shoulder, no hand signals, no chatter, just a tilt of the head, a flicker at the corner of the mouth, and James would know. Push here, hold there, bleed on that note, melt into the pocket until the rhythm turned silk. It was music, yes, but it was also triage. It was ballast for a man carrying a myth that weighed more than any crown. Opening night in Vegas felt like stepping into a storm. The audience wasn't just excited, they were desperate to see if the king was still a king. Elvis stepped out with a grin that could stop the room's pulse and then, as if to test the ceiling, threw a solo to James. "Play it, James." It wasn't merely a cue. It was trust made audible. The room roared. And for the first time in a long time, Elvis looked like a man who felt safe on stage. Touring remade that feeling into ritual. City after city, face after face, the same unspoken liturgy. Elvis looked back, James nodded, the band breathed as one, but ritual has another side. When you repeat a miracle enough times, your body starts keeping score. The travel, the hotels, the late nights, the demand to be incandescent on command, none of it is free. At first the wear was easy to miss. Elvis hid it behind jokes, behind gifts, behind those sudden acts of generosity that made grown men feel like sons again. He'd press a watch into a palm or whisper, "How's your mama?" with a sincerity that made you blink. He made sure the band wasn't a collection of hired hands, but a family with rent paid, worries eased, birthdays remembered. The richest man in the room would suddenly look like a boy who just wanted everyone to have enough. James noticed the other side because he was close enough to hear quiet. The voice that could shake chandeliers sometimes sounded raw in a hotel hallway at 3 a.m. The stride that owned an arena could hesitate at a curtain. The laughter was still real, but after it faded, there'd be a second or two where Elvis looked like he was listening for something none of them could hear. When James thought about leaving, only briefly, and only because other big offers appeared, he felt it in his chest like betrayal. It wasn't obligation, it was kinship. Elvis had given him autonomy other stars wouldn't dare: arrange parts, suggest transitions, stretch a solo until the room swam. Elvis trusted James to catch him Medea. Once you catch a man enough times, you stop counting jumps, you stay. The band learned to read weather. You could feel a rough night gathering like pressure, the room too bright, the noise a little sharp, Elvis's smile a degree off-center. On those nights, James would carve the edges off a solo, soften the attack, let notes linger until the band could slide in under the weight and lift. When it worked, the crowd never knew anything was wrong. When it didn't, the audience still sailed home, stunned, because even on a hard night, Elvis gave more than most men give on their best. Offstage, the gravitational field of Elvis didn't relax, it changed shape. Fans camped in lobbies, phones rang with impossible requests, old friends drifted back with new burdens. Elvis could say no, he often didn't. Giving was how he breathed, and giving sometimes was how he drowned. James loved the late-night gospel sessions most. After the show, when the roar was finally behind them, Elvis would drift toward the songs that built him, harmonies that tasted like memory, chords that made grief useful. James could set his guitar down to a whisper and still feel like he was holding something vast. In those hours, Elvis's face smoothed out, the tension in his jaw unclenched, and the boy from Tupelo came walking back into the room. If you asked James later why he stayed, he might put his hand on his chest and point toward those nights. But loyalty has a cost, and cost has a ledger. The schedule thickened, the rooms got bigger, the expectations bigger still. Newspapers studied his waistline like a weather map. Columnists tried to turn a human being into a headline. That kind of gaze wears on a soul. Elvis wanted to please the crowd, the city, the myth. He wanted to carry the old weight and the new one. He wanted to be unbreakable. No man is. James saw the remedies arrive dressed like solutions. Pills to sleep, pills to wake, pills to find the angle of the day where the heart didn't feel like it was sprinting uphill. He didn't moralize, he worried. A man who knows how to listen could hear rhythms shifting inside the person he loved. A laugh a beat late, a story retold with a detail that wasn't there last week. The tempo of a foot on carpet tapping too fast, then too slow. He told himself it was the life. Then he told himself that the life was telling them something. There were interventions without speeches. James would pull the set a little toward the familiar when Elvis seemed tired, bring in a groove that held like a hammock, call back a guitar phrase from the year the world fell in love with him, ride the muscle memory you can only earn by doing something impossible 1,000 times. He learned where the gentle footholds were and placed them under Elvis's boots without anyone seeing. It is a strange thing to love a legend. Part of you is proud to carry the myth. Part of you wants to lock the human inside the myth away from the world and say, rest. James felt both parts. He also felt something harder to confess, fear, not of losing the gig, of losing the man. He remembered small, ordinary messes, walking past a door and hearing Elvis on the phone saying, "Tell him not to worry, I'll handle it." No performance, no audience, just a friend picking up a burden because he could. James held those moments like talismans when the road grew darker. If a man could still be that gentle in private, maybe he could turn a corner. Maybe the rest would sort itself out. Hope is a habit, and James was good at it. There were good years still, laughter that shook walls, new arrangements that made old songs feel dangerous again, nights when Elvis seemed to grow taller with each number, the look he gave the band when the audience rose in one body, a look that said, "We did that." Those looks mattered. They kept the ledger from feeling one-sided. But cracks have a way of connecting. Little delays between lines became longer. A missed cue here and there could be shrugged off until you realized shrugging had become part of the job. James found himself meeting other eyes on stage, the quick, quiet glances of men who have been to war together and learned to talk with eyebrows. "Are you feeling this? I'm feeling it too. Okay, we adjust." He thought about the word leader. People assumed it meant the loudest voice. James knew better. Leadership in that band was the art of removing friction so Elvis could be Elvis. When the sound mix bit at the high end, he asked for warmth. When the band's timing edged forward under adrenaline, he sunk his heels and made gravity. When Elvis needed a runway to land an ending, James could stretch 2 bars into a featherbed without breaking time. It was work you only notice when it's gone, because without it, the show feels like glass. In rare private moments, James tried to ask careful questions, not interventions, invitations. "You sleeping okay? Want to try this different tomorrow?" Sometimes Elvis nodded. Sometimes he teased him for worrying like a mother hen. Sometimes he just stared at the floor, then told a story so funny you forgot what you came in to say. That was part of the grief, how easy it was to be charmed out of being afraid. The calendar turned to 77, and the road felt longer even when the distances were the same. There were still triumphs. A crowd can turn a man's blood to light, but daylight always comes, and daylight tells the truth no spotlight can hide. James kept telling himself that legends get to rewrite endings. He had seen Elvis do it, after the movies, after the noise, after entire eras had pronounced him done. Why not one more time? Why not now? He thought about the first time he brought that pink Paisley Telecaster on stage, worried Elvis would raise an eyebrow, ready to retire it if the look went wrong. Elvis loved it. He laughed and said it looked like a party. That was Elvis. He could turn your fear into joy in a second. James wanted to believe that man could turn his own fear into joy again. He wanted it like air. The band's inner circle held tighter because that's what families do when a house creaks in a storm. They told each other the truth, or as close to it as they could bear. They repeated the old jokes. They asked for better scheduling and better rest, and sometimes they got it. Other times, the machine kept grinding because machines don't hear prayer. On stage, the ritual never lost its beauty. Elvis's voice could still lower the temperature in a room by 10 degrees and then set it on fire in the next breath. He could still stop a song mid-syllable and make 10,000 people feel like he had just called them by name. He could still turn, grin, and say it, "Play it, James," and James could still answer with the sound of metal becoming mercy. But James felt the math tightening. Greatness multiplied by exhaustion equals risk. The public didn't see it, or they chose not to, because choosing not to see is part of how we love famous people. We accept the gift and ignore the cost. James couldn't ignore it. He counted costs for a living. Music is math at heart. He knew when a tempo was a hair too fast because something else inside the man was a hair too slow. He asked himself the question that follows love like a shadow. How do you protect someone who has to be larger than life to feel alive? He didn't have an answer. He had a guitar, a pair of ears, a long memory, and the stubbornness to stay when staying hurt. There was a moment, quiet, almost nothing, when Elvis finished a number and didn't turn right away. He just stood with his back to the crowd, shoulders rising and falling, the band holding a chord like a hand on a shoulder. James felt something in his chest shift. He played softer, as if softness could buy time. Maybe it did, maybe it didn't, but the chord held until Elvis turned back around and smiled, and for one more night, the myth and the man lined up again. They would not always line up. The curve was already bending. James didn't know how close the end was. None of them did. That's another cruelty of history. You can only circle dates on calendars you've already lived through. If he had known, he would have said something else after a show, lingered at a doorway, invented a reason to keep talking about nothing until the sun came up. Maybe he would have asked the one question he never quite asked. Do you want to stop? and maybe the answer would have been the same as always, not tonight. He tells the story without dramatics because he doesn't need them. The facts are heavy enough. The bond was real enough. The burden was too, and loyalty, his kind, the old kind, meant staying to shoulder both. There would be one last tour that felt more like a promise than a plan. There would be a last show that didn't feel like a last anything at all. There would be a final, play it, James, tossed across a stage like a friendly dare and caught like a vow. It would all look ordinary until it didn't. It would all sound like music until silence arrived and renamed everything. For now, in the middle of that summer before the world changed, James kept tuning the same way he always had. He kept listening. He kept believing that a man who could turn a room into a church could still turn his own story into a resurrection. Love is stubborn like that. It keeps waiting for the next downbeat. And the next downbeat was coming, closer than anyone knew, carrying a choice none of them were ready to face. The summer of 1977 did not arrive gently for Elvis Presley. To the world outside, he was still the king, beloved, electrifying, the man whose very presence could fill an arena before a single note was sung. But to those closest to him, the truth was harder, heavier. Elvis was still shining, yes, but the glow was burning from both ends. James Burton had been with him for nearly 8 years. He'd played behind him in Las Vegas, in sold-out arenas, in towns small and large where the crowds treated Elvis not just as a singer, but as something bigger, almost mythic. He'd seen Elvis tired, he'd seen him restless, he'd even seen him frustrated. But in '77, James saw something different: fragility. It began quietly. Elvis was always a night creature, but the hours grew stranger, the sleep rarer. His health, once hidden under the glamour of jumpsuits and spotlight sweat, started showing cracks. His weight went up and down like a yo-yo. His face sometimes looked puffed, swollen, even when his smile flashed like it always had. He was battling insomnia, pain in his body, and a dependence on medications that promised relief but delivered chains. And yet night after night, Elvis still walked on stage. That stage was oxygen for him. As James would later say, Elvis lived for that moment when the lights hit, when the first note rang out, when he could look out at thousands of faces and give them every ounce of his soul. It wasn't the fame anymore. It wasn't even the money. It was the act of giving. It was what kept him alive. But James could see the cost. During rehearsals, Elvis sometimes seemed distracted, his mind elsewhere. There were nights when his energy faltered, when the tempo lagged, when he leaned heavier on the band to carry him through. And James, ever loyal, ever listening, adjusted. If Elvis's voice cracked, James bent his guitar around it, cushioning the edges. If Elvis forgot a cue, James filled the silence with a riff so natural the crowd thought it was planned. Still, James could not ignore the toll. He worried. The man who once leapt across stages with a fury now moved slower. Sometimes, between songs, he'd breathe harder than he should. There were nights when his eyes looked far away, as if he were carrying something no one else could see. And yet, despite all of this, Elvis could still summon greatness. James remembered those nights like miracles. Elvis would be sluggish backstage, his voice low, his body heavy. And then the curtain would rise, the band would strike the opening notes, and suddenly the king was back. The smile, the energy, the magnetism, it was all there. For 2 hours, Elvis Presley was not sick. He was not tired. He was eternal. It gave James hope. Maybe Elvis could fight through it. Maybe the music would keep him going. Maybe the love of the fans could heal what medicine couldn't. But deep down, James knew something was breaking. The last tour felt different. It wasn't just another set of dates. There was a heaviness around it, a sense that they were pushing against time itself. The band whispered among themselves, trading quiet looks when Elvis seemed especially worn, but no one dared to speak the worst aloud. You didn't tell a man like Elvis Presley to stop. He was bigger than life, and life itself seemed to bend around him. And then came the night of June 26, 1977, Indianapolis, Indiana. None of them knew it then. None of them could have guessed. But that would be the last time Elvis Presley ever stood on stage. The show began like so many others. The crowd was electric, thousands of fans packed into the Market Square Arena. For them, just being in the same room with Elvis Presley was enough. They didn't care about rumors, about tabloids, about his health. they were there for their king. James took his place with the TCB band, guitar in hand, ready. He glanced at Elvis as he always did, checking for that look, that nod. Elvis's face was pale, his body heavier, but when the lights hit, something in him shifted. He straightened his shoulders, adjusted the microphone, and smiled. And then the music began. From the first song, the crowd was on its feet. Elvis sang with every ounce of strength he had left. His voice was rougher than it used to be, sometimes strained, but it still carried that unmistakable power. He poured himself into the songs as if he knew, somewhere deep inside, that this might be the last time. For James, the night was bittersweet. He watched Elvis closely, the way a brother watches another brother when words aren't enough. And then came the moment he would carry with him forever. Elvis turned mid-song, that familiar grin spreading across his face, and he shouted it like he had hundreds of times before, "Play it, James." The crowd erupted. James's fingers moved like second nature, the notes spilling out in fire and light. It was just another cue, just another solo, but James felt something different in it, a finality, a goodbye disguised as routine. The show went on. Elvis smiled, laughed, bowed. He gave everything he had, and when the last note rang out, the arena shook with applause. The king thanked his fans, waved, and walked off stage. There was no speech, no long farewell. No one backstage thought it was the end. They packed up, joked, said their goodbyes as they always did. Elvis was planning to rest at Graceland, then head back out on tour. More shows, more nights, more music. But James felt something tug at him as he walked away. He couldn't explain it. Just a heaviness, a whisper in his chest that this tour had taken more than it gave back. 2 months later, the phone rang. Elvis Presley was gone. James would replay that final show in his mind for the rest of his life. The grin, the cue, the last "Play it, James." He wasn't there when Elvis drew his last breath at Graceland. He wasn't in the room when Ginger Alden found him, but in a way he was there, because that last nod, that last moment on stage, was their goodbye. And the heartbreak wasn't just that Elvis had died at 42. It was that Elvis died while still giving, still trying, still pouring himself out for others. He had been broken, but he had never stopped offering pieces of himself to the world. For James, that was the hardest truth of all. He could still see Elvis backstage, exhausted, but lifting his head to ask, "How's your family?" He could still hear him laughing, still picture him handing away a watch, a ring, a car, just to make someone else smile. He could still feel the way Elvis lit up when gospel songs filled the room. That was the man he knew. That was the friend he loved. And yet he also carried the memory of those last months, the fatigue, the struggle, the weight Elvis bore silently as the world demanded more. That duality haunted James Burton, the brilliance and the burden, the joy and the pain, the king and the man. And when he finally spoke about it decades later, his voice cracked not just from age, but from grief. Because no matter how many years passed, he still carried that last show, that last nod, that last "Play it, James" like a scar on his soul. Elvis Presley's final performance wasn't just a concert. It was a man giving the last of his light to the world. And James Burton was right there, close enough to feel it, close enough to know that something was ending, even if he couldn't name it at the time. And that night in Indianapolis became sacred to him, not because of the music, not because of the crowd, but because it was the final chapter of a bond that went beyond notes and chords. It was brotherhood. It was love. And James would never forget it. August 16th, 1977. The day the world changed forever. The morning at Graceland began quietly. Elvis had stayed up through the night as he often did, reading, packing, drifting between rooms. He wasn't preparing for retirement. He was packing for another tour, determined to step back on stage yet again. To the outside world, there was always another show, another arena, another crowd waiting. But that morning, time ran out. When Ginger Alden opened the bathroom door and found him unresponsive, the illusion shattered. The ambulance was called, the frantic attempts began, but it was too late. By 3:30 p.m., the announcement was official. Elvis Aaron Presley was gone, only 42 years old. News spread like wildfire. Radio stations cut their programming. Television anchors broke down in tears. Crowds gathered outside Graceland, some weeping, some silent, all of them struggling to believe that the man who had seemed immortal, untouchable, was gone. And somewhere, James Burton picked up the phone and heard the words that stopped his breath. He had seen Elvis just weeks earlier in Indianapolis. He had heard him shout, "Play it, James," for the last time. He had thought there would be more shows, more music, more laughter. Now, in an instant, that future was gone. For James, it was more than the death of a legend. It was the loss of a brother. The grief was complicated. The world mourned the king of rock and roll. But James mourned the man who had asked about his family, who had laughed with him at 3 a.m., who had whispered worries into hotel corridors. The Elvis the public never knew. In the days that followed, shock became reality. Thousands lined the streets in Memphis for the funeral. They stood under the August sun, holding signs, crying openly, desperate to touch even a glimpse of the procession that carried Elvis to his final resting place. For his fans, it felt like losing a piece of themselves. For James, it felt like losing part of his heart. He replayed that last concert over and over. The smile, the nod, the cue, the last "Play it, James." That was his goodbye, not in words, not in embraces, but in music, the language they had always shared. The years that followed were not easy. Every interview, every memory, every fan who asked, "What was Elvis really like?" opened the wound again. James could have spoken about the struggles, the pills, the nights of exhaustion. He could have turned pain into bitterness. But he didn't. He spoke instead of kindness, of generosity, of loyalty. He remembered Elvis not as a headline, not as a tragic figure, but as a man who cared deeply about others. The man who made sure the TCB band felt like family. The man who loved gospel more than any other music. The man who gave away cars and jewelry not for show, but because seeing someone's joy meant more to him than keeping it. James told those stories because he wanted the world to remember the Elvis he knew, not the caricature, not the myth bent by tabloids, but the friend whose spirit still echoed in every note of gospel they sang together after midnight. For decades, James carried that mission. Through interviews, through concerts with the reunited TCB band, through tributes and festivals, he kept Elvis's true memory alive. Every time his fingers touched a guitar, a part of Elvis's spirit lived on. Because once you've played with someone that deeply, the music never leaves you. And yet, as the years passed, there was one memory that James had never spoken of in full. The memory that haunted him most. It wasn't the sight of Elvis on stage, nor the sound of fans screaming, nor even the moment he heard the news of his death. It was the silence. The silence after. For years, James admitted, he couldn't pick up a guitar without hearing Elvis's voice in his head, "Play it, James." He'd pause, waiting for the next cue, forgetting for a split second that it would never come again. That silence was the cruelest part, the absence where the music used to live. And yet within that silence, James found a calling, to carry forward the truth of who Elvis was, to remind the world that beneath the crown was a man of flesh and blood, kindness and flaws, light and shadow. He often said that if Elvis had lived, he would have poured himself more deeply into gospel music. That was where his heart truly belonged. James believed that with everything in him, because in those quiet, unguarded hours, that's when Elvis looked most alive. So when James finally spoke openly at 85, his voice breaking, his eyes misting, it wasn't to glorify himself. It wasn't even to glorify Elvis. It was to humanize him. To say, yes, he was the king, but he was also my friend, and losing him broke me. That's the legacy James Burton carried. Not just the riffs, not just the solos, not just the history books that list his name among the greats, but the memory of a man who gave the world everything and asked for very little in return. And perhaps that's why the story still matters, because behind the legend, behind the myth, behind the endless impersonations and Vegas lights, there was a human being who laughed, who wept, who struggled, who gave, who broke, who loved. That's the Elvis James Burton remembers, and that's the Elvis the world should never forget. Because when the lights went down, when the curtain fell, when the roar of the crowd turned to silence, all that was left was the music and the love. James Burton's voice at 85 reminds us of something easy to forget. Behind every legend is a human being, fragile and real. Elvis Presley wasn't just the king of rock and roll. He was a friend, a giver, a man who poured out his soul until there was nothing left. If you believe stories like these must be told, stay with us, subscribe and help keep the heart of Elvis alive for this generation and the next.